You're listening to the Global Research News Hour, broadcasting from ckuw 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and from partnering radio stations across Canada and the United States. Claire Edwards worked for the United Nations as editor and trainer in intercultural writing from 1999 to 2017. Claire had warned the Secretary General about the dangers of 5G during a meeting with UN staff in May of 2018, calling for a halt to its rollout at UN duty stations. Claire's own health had been compromised by the wireless infrastructure she had been exposed to while with the UN. Her appeal to the UN body had been ignored. Claire continues to campaign against 5G and existing wireless technology. We're delighted to have her join us from Vienna. Hello, Claire, and thanks so much for making the time, for this conversation.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be with you.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you also wanted to have some sort of an assessment of the health of the people who had been exposed to this stuff, because you have this sort of closed system where all these people are working in that environment. It should have been fairly straightforward to get such an assessment. But to date, do you have any? Is there any of that data available?
Well, I did put that to the Secretary General because not so many years ago the UN did digitalize its medical records, and this means that you could actually assess the consequences for the UN staff over the last 4 years if you were to look into that data. Now, the problem is that the UN, of course, is extraterritorial, so actually having access to that data would be problematic, and there would have to be discussions about it. But the point is that data is available. And what I know anecdotally from my colleagues who are still working at the Vienna International Center is that people have suddenly died, people have had heart attacks. There seem to have been a phenomenal number of cases of breast cancer. And of course, if you wear a wired bra, that actually has metal inside it, which could re-radiate this signal into your body. There are also a tremendous number of cases of burnout, and burnout is also associated with exposure to electromagnetic radiation. And I did hear that just in recent weeks, they actually held some sort of day of advice and so on, where they brought people into the UN and they had a sort of event to provide advice for people about stress and burnout. So clearly, I would say that the medical service at Vienna is not aware, like medical professionals pretty much anywhere, they're not aware, they're not connecting these health consequences with this excessive exposure of 4 years now for the UN staff.
It's quite scary. We've heard from other guests, most notably Professor Martin Paul and Professor Olle Johnasson, about some of the negative health effects related to wireless and anticipated for the 5G rollout. But what I want to know from you is your insights as a UN staffer and someone who's looked into these issues carefully. Why are official bodies like the UN and world governments seemingly incapable of responding to the threat in a responsible way? Is this some sort of groupthink? Are we talking about key people and key places being bought off? What systemically is happening to prevent responsible policy and or responsible enforcement of existing health and safety standards?
Well, in order to respond to that question, we have to talk about conspiracy, because I have been involved in this campaign for 21 months now, full-time, every day, 7 days a week, and I have looked now at thousands of pages of documents, I've watched videos, and I have thoroughly informed myself. So what is clear is that when you look at the literature emanating from the EU, from the UN, and from other countries, you find that the same terminology is used right across this literature. So you can see that they're all singing from the same song sheet. You have the so-called International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, and for most of the world, it's this ICNIRP that produces the guidelines by which most governments decide on their exposure limits. Now, if you look at ICNIRP, what is it? It is effectively a little club under German law. Now, it's neither international nor a commission. It is a private club of private individuals. They appoint their own members. There is no supervision. There is no transparency. I, living in Austria, I could go and register myself as the International Commission on anything I wanted as an official club under Austrian law in a similar way. So clearly, this ICNIRP has no legitimacy, and we have to ask the question then, why is it that the UN adopts these ICNIRP safety guidelines, which are based on science that actually predates the advent of wireless technology and ubiquitous cell phones?
This ICNIRP, it's a German body, and what is the expertise that animates this? Are there scientists with relevant qualifications?
Well, ICNIRP, as I say, it's a little club, and the members are technical people. So they are scientists, but there are no medical doctors and there are no environmentalists. And what they do is they systematically ignore all the science on the biological effects of electromagnetic radiation, which are extremely well established, but they dismiss all of them. And they propagate what's called the thermal hypothesis. And the thermal hypothesis says that there are no biological effects. This is all about heating. So as long as you hold the cell phone away from your body, you're not being heated, and therefore you are relatively safe, which is not true at all, because there are 10,000 studies on the biological effects of electromagnetic radiation. And in fact, the World Health Organization itself held a symposium in 1972 or 1973, which was actually called The Biologic Effects and Health Hazards of Microwave Radiation. And since then, WHO has chosen to forget that it organized this symposium. And there is a whistleblower from WHO that has exposed the corruption at WHO. The WHO is running a project on electromagnetic fields called the EMF project, and most of the funding for this comes from industry. So the ICNIRP itself has been accused of conflicts of interest multiple times. I've lost count of the number of accusations of conflicts of interest. So one has to ask the question, why does the UN adopt these guidelines? I do not see the legitimacy in this, and these guidelines are ridiculously unprotective, because there was an article just a few months ago where the author took a study that was done on an apartment in Stockholm, a top floor apartment, where there was an antenna about 10 meters away, and Professor Lennart Hardell went in and measured the levels of electromagnetic radiation in this apartment. And based on that, the author of this article calculated that in order for the ICNIRP so-called safety guidelines to be exceeded, you would need to have 666,000 such antennas around that apartment, which gives you a sense of how completely unprotective these so-called safety guidelines are.
was wondering if you could give us a little bit more of your understanding of another aspect of this. The 5G rollout is the use of satellites in orbit that's getting a lot of attention lately, and it's this is in addition to these antennas that are going to be. Like I think they're talking about 60 antennas for every man, woman, and child on the planet. That's on the ground. What is behind, in your view, the launching of all these satellites to integrate with this 5G system? Is it really necessary for the networks that they're wanting to construct, and why?
Well, another thing that we have to understand about this is that everything about this 5G rollout is unclear. And I think this is deliberately so. And I think 5G itself is actually a diversion, because I think actually what it means is something else altogether. So unraveling all of this is quite complex. 5G means densification. So as you've said, on the ground, you would have this 5G absolutely everywhere, coming at you from absolutely everywhere. Outside every house, cabinets on the street, under manhole covers on the street, in your home, from smart meters, just everywhere. And then you have the satellite situation. So it's not just the satellites. So the satellites, currently there are approximately 53,000 satellites plus planned. But even in addition to the satellites, you're also looking at pseudo-satellites in the stratosphere, which would also be providing internet access for underserved areas, so less populated areas. And then you're also talking about civil aircraft being networked also to provide broadband access and beam that down to Earth. So you're actually talking about at least 3 layers. Now, the satellites, there are a number of issues with regard to these satellites. When I was working at the UN, I was editing the documents of the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And I can tell you that the 2 major issues, year after year after year, were space debris and weaponization. So let's deal with them one by one. Space debris. There was a paper written in the late 1970s, I think, by a man called Kessler, who posited what became called a Kessler syndrome. And he said you could reach a situation where there would be so much space debris in the space orbits, and this space debris is of course caused by all the activities in space, over the decades of space exploration. And he suggested that you could have this situation where you reached such a density of space debris that you could have a cascade of collisions which would become unstoppable. So this was called a Kessler syndrome. And he suggested that the space orbits could then become unusable for 1,000 years. So the space debris was a very, very major issue. Now, according to the size of space debris that you look at, there are between 500,000 of a certain size and millions of a tiny size, bits of space debris up there. So although the UN, year after year after year, was very concerned about space debris, suddenly we have a situation where now we're going to put up 53,000 satellites in a free-for-all, and we no longer even talk about the concern of space debris. Then the other issue was always weaponization, and every meeting somebody would always talk about the issue of weaponization of space. Now you have the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which actually says that it is illegal to put weapons in space. So you have to understand that you already have the problem of space debris. We already have satellites in the Earth orbits that are using nuclear power sources, and there have been problems in the past with this radiation from nuclear objects actually reaching Earth. There was a situation, I think, some decades ago. So the idea of having an extremely dense situation with this space debris, plus the nuclear power sources on existing satellites, then putting weapons in space, well, the militaries of the various countries do depend on satellites for their intelligence. So if you start putting weapons up there and you already have the space debris problem, then you could have a situation where one of these satellites used for military intelligence blips out and nobody knows. It could have just been a collision with space debris or a collision with one of these 5G satellites, and it blips out, and that country might believe that it's under attack and could launch nuclear missiles or other means of defense. So this is extremely dangerous, what is going on. Now you have the situation even further complicated because in December 2019, NATO declared space a domain of warfare. And I haven't really seen this discussed anywhere, but declaring space a domain of warfare, as far as the Outer Space Treaty is concerned, I don't see that that declaration is illegal. But as soon as they do put a weapon in the Earth orbits, that does become illegal under the Outer Space Treaty. Now, France has decided to launch a space force. The US has decided to launch a space force. And they are both signatories to the Outer Space Treaty. So, regardless of the 5G aspects, and of course, if you just look at the 5G aspects of these 53,000 satellites, it's not actually clear yet the function of these satellites. And as far as I understand it, the telecommunications companies have not yet worked out how these satellites are going to communicate with the ground stations that they need. So these satellites, now it is complicated because you have different Earth orbits, and these 5G satellites are going to be in the low Earth orbit or the very low Earth orbit. And the reason for this is that this would be closest to the Earth, closest to the ground. And therefore, what they are seeking is what they call low latency. So, as instant a communication as possible. And if you use the higher Earth orbits, then you would not have that low latency. So, let's say the most desirable orbit would be geosynchronous orbit, where the satellite can always be above its target on the Earth and it would remain in situ above that target. But if you put your 5G satellites in geosynchronous orbit, then you would not have low latency. And this is why they've chosen the low Earth orbits. Now, the problem with the low Earth orbit and very low Earth orbit is, as I understand it, is that the satellite will only remain in range for about 10 minutes. So you're going to have to hand off the ongoing communications or calls on the cell phones, you're going to have to hand them off from one satellite to the next as the satellites move on. And they have not solved how that's going to happen. So technically, they have not resolved how this is going to work. So as far as I'm concerned, I find all of this unconscionable. We have astronomers and meteorologists complaining about this and saying this is going to wreck their scientific endeavors. And in the case of meteorologists, of course, they are predicting the weather for us. And this has very serious implications for a lot of our activities on Earth, such as aviation, such as maritime traffic, such as our GPS systems and so forth. We actually do need these things. So why is it that commercial interests trump everybody else?
We hear activists, note many of them well-intentioned, focusing overly much on the health impacts, and to be certain those are a concern, but without, widening the scope of the conversation. Is there a danger that we could shift our focus away from what it should be? So, So we may end up with activism that's more geared toward protecting us from the health impacts rather than putting an end to this agenda. Do you have any concerns about the misleading of this movement?
I think that there is a great deal of confusion, and deliberately so. This is being rolled out extremely fast. And as I say, the technical aspects of this are not even worked out. So one has to question exactly why is it that this is being characterized as a race, that each country is in a race with all the other countries to get this rolled out first. I think it's extremely suspicious. There are a couple of reasons, major reasons for that. What people have to understand is that with 5G, there is no coming back. Now, in normal circumstances, when we are confronted with problems such as, for example, tobacco or asbestos, we can make a mistake, and of course, tragically, many people are injured and many people die. But eventually the mistake is realized and laws are put in place and people are protected, and we say, okay, well, we learned our lesson. But with 5G, you see, this is something totally, totally different, because this is cosmic in implications. This is the end of life as we know it. This is about putting a total surveillance and control grid in place. You only have to look at what's happening in China, where you can see the social crediting system, which has already blacklisted 13 million people who are now non-persons in Chinese society. So you have that control grid aspect, and you also have the very serious health and environmental implications. So in terms of health, Professor Martin Paul has talked about brain injuries, which he said could happen very quickly, and we would no longer be able to function as societies because nobody would be able to think properly. Now, you have a scientist in the United States at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who is predicting that every second baby will be autistic in the United States by 2025. So you begin to see that if this is allowed to happen, now you've also got implications of sterility, which I'm sure you've also discussed with Professor Olle Johnasson and Professor Martin Paul. So you have also irreversible sterility. Now, you already have Wi-Fi in schools. It's established that this causes sterility. So we're already heading for a serious problem of infertility. And Barry Trower, the British weapons expert, says that within 5 generations, and that's not 5G, that's based on previous generations of wireless technology, not on 5G. But he says within 5 generations, you would have 100% sterility. So with 5G, all of this would happen a great deal faster. So what I'm saying here is that this 5G is a mistake that cannot be allowed to happen, because you would not be able to come back from it. So I believe it's being characterized as a race, and it was given the name 5G or 5th generation so that people would assume that it was just an upgrade from the 4th generation. But that's not the case. This is a completely different technology.
Claire, I was just wondering, in the time remaining, what course of action do you recommend listeners do to try to resist or reverse this diabolical agenda, as it would seem to be?
Yeah, I would definitely call it diabolical. Well, I believe that 5G has a form and a function, and the two are very different. So the form of 5G is as I've described, but the function is that 5G would be completely inescapable for the reasons that I've described. It's proposed to be absolutely everywhere, saturating the entire planet, and it is a global agenda. So, unlike all previous problems that we've faced, you're not going to be able to protect yourself from 5G. You're not going to be able to move house. You're not going to be able to go to a country where it does not exist. You're not going to be able to shelter. You're not going to be able to go underground. So you only have one choice with 5G. As I've said, it cannot be reversed once it's there. So this requires every individual now to take responsibility. And I think the major problem we have on the planet is that people don't take responsibility and they don't inform themselves. So for the first time, we have something where people really must inform themselves, they must inform other people, and they must then take action. And I see this as individual action. So I see this actually as personal transformation. And this is something that I've lived for the last 20 months, because I've actually changed hugely in these 20 months and learned an awful lot and started to do all sorts of things for the first time, which I've never done before in my life. And I think when individuals change, then you've actually changed the paradigm on the planet. So in a sense, I actually see this as a spiritual process. But what I'm extremely concerned about is that the perpetrators of 5G are actually hijacking the Stop 5G movement. And I became aware of this just a few weeks ago. And we have to be extremely careful, I believe, not to be collectivized, because if that happens, then we will once again give our power away and we will be manipulated, exploited, and misdirected. So I would say to everybody, please, as an individual, take responsibility, inform yourself, and stand up and say no to this agenda.
Claire Edwards, I want to thank you very much. We're certainly not finished with this subject. We're going to be doing more shows in the future for sure, but I want to thank you for sharing your insights.